Hey everyone, Eric here. Today we're going to learn about Microsoft Visual Studio 2022 and how to install the free community version. I've used Visual Studio in my professional life for over 2 decades now, and I can tell you it's probably the best IDE on the market. I'll go over some of its pros in a minute, but I will tell you it tries very hard to be all things to all people and is therefore extremely bloated and heavily integrated into Windows. Another con is that it is specific to Microsoft Windows, so if you're looking for an IDE that is cross-platform, you may be better served by Visual Studio's little brother, Visual Studio Code. Nothing wrong with that. Code is an extremely lightweight IDE. So, what is Visual Studio anyway? It is a powerful integrated development environment, or IDE, used primarily for software development. It provides tools and features for coding, debugging, and testing applications across multiple platforms, including web, desktop, cloud, and mobile. Developed by Microsoft, Visual Studio supports a wide range of programming languages such as C++, C#, Visual Basic, Python, JavaScript, and more, allowing developers to work on different types of projects within a single environment. Some of its more important features are code editing, advanced code editor with IntelliSense, which provides code suggestions and completion, making it easier to write code accurately and quickly. Debugging. Robust debugging tools help identify and fix issues in code with breakpoints, watches, and step-by-step execution. Version control. Integration with Git, Azure DevOps, and other version control systems to manage code repositories and collaborate on projects. Extensions and customization. Extensive marketplace of plugins and extensions to add new functionalities, from language support to custom tools. Testing and profiling. Built-in testing tools for writing and running unit tests, along with profiling tools to analyze performance. Visual Studio is available in multiple editions, including Community, which is free for individual developers and small teams, Professional and Enterprise with advanced tools and support for larger teams. It's widely used by developers and teams for creating applications for Windows, Android, iOS, and cross-platform applications with ease. Before we begin the install, let's take a quick look at the Visual Studio comparison chart so we can see how the Community Edition stacks up against the paid versions. Alright, so here's the comparison chart. The Community Edition, which we will be installing, is the column to the left. For supported usage scenarios, you're restricted to only 5 users. That's still a good deal if you ask me. Under Integrated Development Environment, you lose some options that you would only receive under the Enterprise Edition. I personally have never used these options, so I'm not too worried. In Advanced Debugging and Diagnostics, you do lose some features, of course, but again, they're features only available in Enterprise, and again, they are features I may have used only a couple of times in my career. In testing tools, you do take a little bit of a hit losing out on some of the more advanced testing features. You would have to be a huge fan of unit testing, though, to miss these, and there are free replacements available that can plug right into Visual Studio. Now let's talk cross-platform development. Looks like you'll lose out on embedded assemblies. They are assemblies that are bundled directly into an application package. By embedding assemblies, developers can streamline deployment, improve app performance, and control assembly loading more efficiently. Looking at collaboration tools and features, it looks like all editions are treated equally, which is great. In my opinion, if you're interested in learning to code in C# or some other language supported by Visual Studio, I think the Community Edition is just fine. Some of the missing pieces that are supported under the Enterprise Edition can be found, usually for free, as a plugin to the IDE. So, moving on to the meat of the video, let's go over how to install Visual Studio. You may want to buckle up for this because it is, by far, the most complicated installer I've ever worked with. To download the Visual Studio installer, click on the Free Download button. I've included the link to the edition comparison page so you can download the installer. The downloadable installer itself is very small and will download in a second or two. Everything after that will take time, as the installer will reach out to Microsoft in order to download what it needs for Visual Studio. To begin, click on the Open file to start the installer. Click on Yes to allow the app to make changes. Click on Continue and wait for the rest of the installer to complete. This can take a few minutes. Once that's done, the installer starts up, and we can see it's broken up into 4 sections. The first one is workloads. These are pre-packaged sets of tools, libraries, and components tailored for specific types of development, allowing developers to install only the features they need for a particular project. This modular approach makes Visual Studio setup faster and more efficient, letting users avoid unnecessary tools that would otherwise make the IDE bulky and slower to load. Unlike workloads, which bundle related components for a particular development type, individual components let you pick exactly what you need without installing an entire workload. Language packs are add-ons that allow you to change the display language of the Visual Studio IDE. They translate menus, dialog boxes, error messages, and other user interface elements, making it easier for developers who prefer to work in a language other than English. Installation Locations in Visual Studio installs its files in several locations on your computer, with each location serving a specific purpose in supporting the IDE's functionality. These locations vary slightly depending on your installation choices, edition, and version of Visual Studio, as well as customizations made during installation. More than likely, you'll only be using the Workloads tab, unless you bump into some specific requirements where you'll need to include some individual components. You'll probably only discover that after you've been using Visual Studio for a while. On the right side of the installer, you'll see a column called Installation Details. This area lets you know what has been installed or you have checked to be installed. Below that is some text telling you the amount of space required, with a possible warning about not having enough room to install Visual Studio. And directly below that is a drop-down allowing you to either download while installing or download everything first prior to installing. I normally just leave it with download while installing. And next to that is the all-important install button. Right now it says install, but later on it may be called modify or even close, as you'll see soon enough. I'm going to stick with only the workloads for this demonstration. As you can see by scrolling through the list of workloads, there is support for all sorts of development, everything from Python development to Unity video game design. To keep it simple, I'll just check the data storage and processing workload. Notice when I clicked on data storage and processing, the installation details changed to reflect the addition of the workload. Also, the total space has increased to over 6 gigabytes. Alright, let's click on the install button. Now we get to watch the progress of the installation. It is several gigs, so feel free to take a coffee break. It's not going anywhere. Okay, so we're using the Community Edition, no real need to sign in since we don't have an account. Let's click on Skip this for now. Now you have some other choices to make here. For color scheme, I'm going with blue. There's a development settings drop-down that allows you to select what type of language you'll be programming in. I'm going to choose Visual C#, and then click on Start Visual Studio. Now we're in Visual Studio. We had the option to open a recent project, which right now we have none since we haven't created any. We can create a new project. I want to click on Create a New Project. Select Console App and click on the Next button. Now we can enter in the project name. I'm just going to leave it as Console App 1. And in fact, I think I'll just leave all of the default settings. Now just click on the Create button. And there you go, we're officially in Visual Studio and ready to start programming. Just for fun, I'll add a command to write something to the console output. And a console read key to keep the console app running so we can see the output. And click on the Start button, or you can click on F5. There you go, a fully functional C# application, albeit not very useful, but for the purposes of exercising the Visual Studio, it served its purpose. Okay, let's close the IDE and we'll see the installer is still running. We haven't seen this form for the installer yet. It's the precursor to the Modify form that we used to install Visual Studio initially. It will list all Visual Studio versions you have installed on your system, as well as any warnings or errors that occurred during the installation. Each installed version will have this container and these buttons for you to interact with it. The Modify button will take us to the form we were just on and allows us to add additional workloads, individual components, etc. The Launch button is not really useful. It just launches the version of Visual Studio we're working with, which can be done either by clicking on a shortcut or searching for it in the taskbar. The More button is actually a drop-down. The first two options are pretty self-explanatory. If you think there's a problem with your installation of Visual Studio, you can do a repair, and the installer will do its best to figure out what the problem is and fix it. Uninstall will remove this version of Visual Studio, but will not uninstall the installer itself. In fact, let's close the installer and search for it in the taskbar by typing Visual Studio. You'll see the IDE is listed as well as the installer, which is a completely separate application. Let's launch the installer again and click on the Modify button. Now we're back in the installer screen, where we can add additional workloads or individual components. Notice that the total space required is 0 bytes, and below that is a close button. That's an indication that there are no changes to be installed on Visual Studio. Let's try adding another workload. I'll click on Python Development. See how the installation details changed? The space required changed to 337 megabytes, and the Close button changed to Modify. Once I've decided on what I want to add to Visual Studio, I click on Modify to install it, and click on Yes. Now we have the same install progress bars as we had earlier. There you go. We can now create Python projects in Visual Studio as well as have Python language support. How awesome is that? And that's pretty much everything you need to know about how to work with the Visual Studio 2022 installer. Like I said earlier, this is probably the most comprehensive installer I've ever worked with, and does require a little getting used to, which is why you may feel a little overwhelmed at first. But that's okay. Just watch this video. Like a lot, and you'll be fine. If you found this content useful, it would sure help out the channel if you would give the video a like. I cover all sorts of technologies, including software development, hardware support, and software tools. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.